All right, to begin disassembling any weapon, the first thing we need to do is verify the status of the weapon. So we need to make sure we remove any ammunition source. After that, we want to lock the chamber back, both visually and physically inspect the chamber, ensure that there is no ammunition anywhere in sight. Once we've done that, we've ensured there is no ammunition in our workspace as well. So now we can begin the disassembly. So to start the field stripping portion of breaking down the Smith & Wesson M&P 2.0, our first step is going to be to lock the slide to the rear. We're then going to take the tool out of the pistol grip and rotate, and I don't know if you can see it, but we're rotating down the sear retainer. After that, we're going to rotate the takedown lever by 90 degrees, release the slide, and we've then separated the components into its two basic parts, the upper receiver and the lower receiver. Going to work on the upper receiver first. So the first thing we're going to do is remove the recoil spring and remove the barrel. So once those two parts are removed, we've got the receiver essentially field stripped. The upper receiver essentially field stripped. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to remove the firing pin, and for stripping the actual receiver, that is where this process is going to stop, because I do have a optic on this firearm and I don't wish to re-zero it. I can talk about the steps we would take to further break down the slide or upper receiver, whatever you want to call it, but we're going to stop there. So the firing pin breaks down into 4 different components. You've got a retainer clip, the spring, another retaining clip, and the recoil spring for the firing pin to ensure it comes back into its full position. So now if we look in here, there's a couple other components that we can take out. So number one, we can take out the extractor, but to do that, I'd have to remove this optic. As I said, there's a pin right there that holds that in place. And then also we'd have to remove the optic to take off the plunger that retains the firing pin. So to remove those pieces, we'd have to take off my optic. I can do it. I'm just choosing not to because I don't have time before my next shift where I'm working to go ahead and requalify. And if I'm going to mess with my optic at all, then it would only be appropriate and right to requalify. All right, get my little metal plate out here so I can get these metal pieces in here where they'll stick. Some of them don't have metal, but it's still better to keep everything in one place. So as I said, for the slide, that's as far as we're going to break it down. Now to move on to the lower receiver. So we have in the lower receiver, we have a directional pin right here. So this pin can only be removed going in one direction. The front pin, the front takedown pin, can be removed in either direction. Where this gets a little tricky, and when we're taking this apart, is the trigger spring is put on through this pin. So we have to make sure that the tension on the trigger spring doesn't allow the spring to go flying and we don't lose it. And we also have to ensure that when we're putting it back together, it's getting put back on with that trigger pin in mind. So here, just going to use the brass hammer and a punch to drive this directional pin out first. So we get to a point where the pin is longer than the holes that are allowing it to sit. So right now, like I said, we still have that trigger spring locked in by the punch. I'm going to put my finger right there to keep it from flying out and remove my punch. So moving on to the front retention pin, same thing. I'm going to move to a smaller punch. Don't want to open up my hole any. So, the thing with these polymer weapons is you need to be careful of the force you're applying on the polymer. It can inevitably stretch it out too far. So these parts are usually a little tight and a little hard to get out. You can try and give it some force with this. I'm not gonna force it with a piece of the firearm that may break, so just take out a flat tip screwdriver and use a little lever action to remove that. Once we remove that, the takedown lever comes out. So with that takedown lever out, we have now got the front slide area taken out. So now we'll remove the trigger. When we're removing the trigger, we need to do it with care and ensure that we're not just yanking up on it, because the trigger bar extends under the sear to allow it to work, and we don't want to bend or break that. When this goes back together, I need it to function. As I said, it's a work firearm. So we don't lose any pins, just drop them in there. The trigger spring, all of that is going to be fine where it is. The next thing we're gonna do, and the furthest that we're gonna take this firearm apart, is going to be, we're going to remove the sear housing. So to remove the sear housing, this pin is a multi-directional pin. So just gonna tap on it with a little bit of force. Get the pin removed. And again, this one is probably going to be more tight than the last one. Using a little bit of leverage to get in here and force the sear housing up. So, and this is the sear housing. So Smith & Wesson does train us armorers to take this apart. I'd rather not do it. As soon as you do, all this stuff is under spring pressure in here. And as soon as I take it apart, there's a good chance stuff is going flying. On top of stuff going flying, putting it back together, especially for the purposes of this video, is not an easy task. You can see that this is another directional pin that is in the sear housing. So when this goes back into the firearm, we end up with issues sometimes of this pin not being in the right placement. Neither side can be flush with the sear housing. If it is, it won't fit back into the receiver. So, but now we have stripped this firearm as far as we're allowed to strip it per Smith & Wesson. So in here, this part can be removed, but if you remove it, you're going to scratch up and damage all the polymer in the stock. The 2.0 has larger metal rails inside to support the frame. So that's what makes this firearm a little more unique. I forgot to take the butt plate off. So now it is fully disassembled, with the exception of the magazine release, which to remove that, there's a spring inside the magazine well that locks into a groove. Once that's removed from the groove, you just got to force it around. If I could get the screwdriver to sit on it where I want it. Typically I use a starter punch for that, and that's what I'm going for right now. If I have one in here. No starter punches in here. So I guess I'll use what I have. go. So, and this is the magazine release. So now we've got the lower receiver and the slide fully disassembled as far as we're taking them down. Like I said, we've still got the extractor that we could pull off of this and the striker plunger. We could also remove the sights. I don't have access to a front and rear sight tool for this firearm. Like I said, I don't want to mess with my zero. I don't want to mess with the orientation of the sights. So now to start the reassembly, we're going to do it in the reverse order of disassembly. So the first thing I'm going to put back in is going to be the magazine release. And like I said, I typically do that with a starter punch because it holds on to the top of the spring. I just don't have any up here with me. So, and it's an ambidextrous mag release, so I could put it on either side. We're gonna put the back strap back on. So now that that's back on, we're gonna begin to reassemble the firearm. So the first thing I'm gonna put in is that sear housing. Like I said, you have to make sure that the placement of this one directional pin in the sear housing is in the right place, or else it will not fit back into the firearm. So it's protruding out a little too far right there. So now we have it back in, holes are lined up. Verify it with the punch that we've got nothing sticking out before I start to drive a pin back in. So then right here, we're just going to use the nylon side of the hammer and tap it back into the firearm. So we've got it flush on the one side, we want it centered. So just using punch and tiny bit of pressure, going to push it back through until it's centered in the firearm. So now here's where the reassembly can get fun. Didn't even do it on purpose, but I was going to talk about it. So this spring loves to come off the trigger bar. And with it loving to come off the trigger bar and needing to be on there, it generally does it once you've got the trigger back into the weapon. Then you need to take it back out or get a pair of needle pliers and hold it in place. But once you've got it back in there, you want it held into this little channel, because what we're going to do is try and get it lined up like this when we're reassembling the firearm. I don't know if you can see it clearly, but you want the spring head to be lined up with the holes. So now, like I said, with taking this out, you have to put it back in the same way with care to ensure that you get the trigger bar under the sear housing. So now that we've got that in a good place, need to ensure the trigger is resting in the appropriate place. So next thing we're going to put in is our ambidextrous slide release, which is going to force the trigger bar into the correct position, kind of giving a little more guidance to the place. And now we're going to reassemble our front rail. Again, this is a unidirectional part, so it only allows you to reassemble it one way. And unlike the former M&P 1.0, this has to be assembled before it's into the gun. So to get it assembled back together appropriately, you have to get it assembled before it's in the gun. If you try to do it after, it won't go in because the slide will block its placement. So it's the tension along the polymer frame that keeps the takedown lever in place. Now, as I said, this hole, this punch hole is one directional. So it's not as simple as just being able to put it in either way. This is where we're going to deviate from the takedown. So we're going to put this pin in first because it's the most trouble. And we don't want to lose the spring. So if you use a punch as I did and keep the tension on the spring, it allows you to push that right through and force it into place. So this, we need to ensure it's flush with the receiver or it won't let the takedown lever rotate back into place. Now we have the multi-directional pin, but we're going to put it in the same direction to which we removed it. And this pin is safe to protrude a little further through. So if we look and it's flush, it's not acting as the stop for the takedown lever and allows the takedown lever to rotate a little further than it needs to. So we're going to push this pin just a little bit further through than flush to allow it to make contact with the takedown lever and stop it from rotating too far. I still can go a little bit more on that. So, and then right there, it makes contact with that takedown lever and stops it from over rotating. It's not something we want to deal with. So now for reassembly of the upper receiver, the first thing we need to do is reassemble the firing pin. So step one on reassembling the firing pin is putting in the sear recoil spring. So that's putting the sear back into place after it's been fired. So, and then this shroud for the seared needs to go on in this direction. If you see the cut of this nylon shroud, it is cut almost exactly in half. However, it's got this little portion right there, if you can see it, that is cut out a little bit more. And that cutout is so that it wraps snugly around this little nub or lug on the sear. So once those two pieces are on, the next thing is going to be the striker spring. And I'm sorry, I was just calling it a sear for some reason. My apologies. But the striker spring. So this needs to be pulled all the way back with tension. And then we have another nylon stopper. That is, the directionality of this is also important. So if you look, there's two different diameters of the top and the bottom, and that just slides over the firing pin on the striker. And then you have the striker assembly complete once both nylon rings are locked into place. So to reinstall this, we're going to place it in. We're going to push down on the plunger to allow the striker to seat fully in there. So then we're also going to push down on this nylon bushing until this seats fully into the striker housing. So now that's seated fully into the striker housing, we can start to put on the butt plate. So And by starting, I legitimately mean just starting it in there, because we have to do one more thing in order to get it to go on all the way, and that's pull that nylon bushing all the way back into its seated position, release the tension. That locks on the butt plate of this firearm. So now for full reassembly, put the barrel in at a slight angle, let it go forward and slide it back. Now the recoil spring, one thing I like about Smith & Wesson, it does wear with time, and not that the two sides look exactly the same. You've got a, I don't know if it's a octagon or a hexagon shape on the front, and then a flat on the rear, but the painted side of the recoil spring goes into the housing on the slide, and then the flat side goes into the barrel. Once we've done that, we're ready for reassembly, complete reassembly of the firearm. Make sure our takedown pin is rotated to its 90-degree position. So, as I was afraid of this piece from being taken down, begins to bend a little bit. Now it's in place. So now it should be reassembled. Push that back up into the locking area. Rotate the takedown lever back to its parallel position. And then the next thing we're going to do is, using the tool from the butt, from the grip, push that sear takedown lever back up, reinstall the tool, and now we can move on to our functions check. So with the complete assembly and disassembly of the weapon, put this back in here. I've got some Glock parts for a firearm I'm working on for another project. Put that back in there, keep those safe. So now we have this weapon reassembled, we can perform our functions check. So the first part of the functions check, and again, we're handling a weapon, so just like any other time I'm going to be pulling a trigger, I want to verify it's clear. So visually, physically inspect, look away, visually, physically inspect again. So now this weapon has no mechanical safety, so the only safety that is on here is a trigger safety. And in order to operate the trigger safety, if you pull the trigger without depressing the release button up here, you get nothing. So we do that, it's nothing. So now the next step, with the weapon pointed in a safe direction, making sure nobody's around, pull the trigger, should hear the striker engage. So the striker worked. We're going to cycle the weapon, release the trigger back to its breaking point, hear the sear re-engage, so we know it works. One more time, cycle the slide, sear re-engages, comes back to that hard wall, so we're certain it works. So we're going to lock the weapon back to the rear. The next step in taking down and fully stripping a firearm is going to be magazine maintenance. So when it comes to the magazines, as I just did there, there's this little pressure plate that fits right inside the hole on the bottom of the magazine that locks the plate into position. So, and these are all the components of the magazine. You've got the steel tube, the spring with the polymer or plastic follower, which could use some TLC. Then you've got the butt plate and the stopper plate. So in reassembly is simple. Ensure that your follower is in there in the intended direction. And grab that stopper plate, ensure it's lined up with the bottom of the spring. And then the next step is going to be putting the butt plate back onto the magazine. So it locks in place. So now to complete the functions check, we're going to move check the firearm with a couple snap caps just to ensure that it's working. So, like I said, no live ammunition in the area whatsoever, only snap caps, as you can see, painted, no ballistics to them. So, put these 3 snap caps in. This is where we're really going to check for the extraction and injection on the cycle, because with a dry functions check, you can't check those portions. So again, visually, physically inspecting, making sure no ammunition magically got into the weapon while we were handling other objects. So loaded only with snap caps. Insert the magazine or the ammunition, the source of ammunition. Release the slide. Make sure it's extracting that round from the magazine, forcing it up into the chamber on the feeding tube. So make sure that the extractor is grabbing on. It is. Sorry, when doing stuff slowly on a weapon that is designed to work with force, sometimes things don't seat all the way. So now that the extractor worked, so we're going to run through the full functions check. So again, operating a weapon slowly when it's not intended to be doesn't allow everything to seat appropriately. So we're going to release the slide at full force, ensure it rocks all the way forward. I can see that the extractor is pushed out, meaning that it's got a hold of the rim of the round. Not sure if you could see it on there, but you can see the snap cap through the peak hole. So it has picked up and chambered that round. So now with the weapon oriented in a safe direction, I'm gonna go ahead and attempt to pull the trigger without depressing the safety. It doesn't fire. Pull the trigger. Striker fires. Now extraction, again, we're gonna try and do this slow to make sure extraction is working. Now with ejection, I'm gonna angle it down towards the table so I don't lose my snap cap. So ejection works. Let it cycle one more time. Release, listen for the metallic click of the sear. Pull the trigger again. Ejection, extraction, cycled, picked up the next round. Now this is another function of not only the firearm that I'm going to be checking in this next step, but of the magazines. With these plastic Smith & Wesson magazines, I have noticed that the wear and tear does wear out the stopper on the magazine and stops it from locking the slide to the rear on an empty magazine. So release the trigger, sear re-engages, pull the trigger, striker fires, cycles, and the magazine does push up on the locking lever. So now remove the feed source, ensure that we have a clear weapon, no ammo anywhere in sight, and that is complete of the takedown and reassembly of the Smith & Wesson M2.0 9mm.